May 17, 1839, Savannah, Georgia. A date that would be whispered in scandalized tones across drawing rooms and slave quarters alike. The night Annabelle Crowe, 42-year-old widow and mistress of one of Savannah's wealthiest estates, stood before a makeshift altar in a forgotten chapel room and married Samuel, the man her late husband had owned. By candlelight, witnessed only by trembling house servants who knew the cost of what they were seeing, she placed a crude ring on the hand that still bore the scars of iron restraints. She wore black silk. He wore the only shirt he owned. And for 3 stolen months, they were husband and wife in a world that would kill them both for it. Annabelle Crowe was born into Northern money, raised with books and piano lessons, taught that slavery was distasteful but necessary. Then she married Edward Crowe Sr. and learned that distasteful was too gentle a word. For 20 years she played the role, the perfect Southern matriarch, hosting dinners, managing house servants, bearing a son who would inherit everything. She learned to smile while her husband bought and sold human beings like livestock. She learned to sleep through the screams from the quarters. She learned to be dead inside while still breathing. Then Edward Sr. died, and for the first time in 2 decades, Annabelle could breathe without permission. And Samuel, the carpenter her husband had purchased 15 years ago, the man who had built every piece of furniture in her home, who had been taught to read in secret by his mother before she was sold away, who spoke with quiet dignity even when the world demanded his silence. Samuel looked at her not as property looks at an owner, but as a man looks at a woman. And something inside her, something she thought had died years ago, flickered back to life. It started with conversations in the rose garden at dawn, then shared meals in the workshop when no one was watching, then stolen moments that turned into stolen nights. Samuel never asked for freedom. He asked for her heart. And Annabelle, who had spent 42 years doing what society demanded, who had buried every genuine feeling under layers of propriety and fear, said yes. Not to scandal, not to rebellion, but to love. The first real love she had ever known. The wedding was her idea. No legal document could recognize it. No church would perform it. But she needed the vows, needed to speak them aloud, to make sacred what the world called sin. 3 house servants stood witness, tears streaming down their faces, knowing that what they were seeing was both beautiful and deadly. Annabelle and Samuel spoke their promises in whispers, bound their lives together with words that had no legal weight but carried the full force of their souls. She wore his crude ring beneath her widow's gloves. No one noticed. No one suspected. For 3 months, she lived 2 lives. By day, the respectable widow managing her estate, tolerating her son's increasing presence in household affairs. By night, Samuel's wife, sharing meals in his quarters, falling asleep in arms that had known chains, but held her with a gentleness she had never imagined. She was happier in those 3 months than in all her previous years combined. And she knew, every single day, that it couldn't last. Her son Edward Jr. had his father's eyes and his father's cruelty, but refined, made sharper by education and entitlement. He watched his mother with suspicion, noticed the way she spoke Samuel's name, the way her face softened when the carpenter entered a room. And when a betrayed house servant, desperate to save her own skin from punishment, whispered the truth, Edward's rage was biblical. Not because his mother had taken a lover. Southern widows did that quietly all the time. But because she had married beneath her race, had chosen a slave over her own blood, had made herself equal to property. Before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. What Edward did next would haunt Savannah for generations. He had Samuel dragged to the courtyard at dawn and whipped to death while Annabelle watched from her bedroom window, held back by servants who knew defiance meant their own deaths. 27 lashes. She counted every one. Samuel's last word was her name. When they finally let her go, she collapsed beside his body and stayed there until they dragged her away. Edward locked his mother in the attic to repent for her sins, to pray for forgiveness, to remember her place. But Annabel Crowe wasn't praying. She was remembering every kindness Samuel had shown her, every gentle word, every moment of genuine love in a life that had known so little. And she was planning, because grief, when it has nowhere else to go, transforms into something far more dangerous. This is the true story of Annabel Crowe, a 42-year-old widow whose forbidden love was shattered by her own son's cruelty, and whose grief could no longer bear the weight of a society built on chains and hypocrisy. While Savannah's gentry sipped imported wine and discussed cotton prices, while they debated politics and planned balls and married off their daughters to men with land and names, Annabel Crowe's world was expanding, one forbidden touch at a time. She had arrived in Savannah in 1817, a northern bride of 19, married to a southern gentleman twice her age. Edward Crowe Sr. owned 2,000 acres, 143 human beings, and a Greek revival mansion that looked like something from a storybook. Her mother had called it a good match. Annabel learned quickly what that meant. It meant money without love, security without joy, a life of comfort built on the broken backs of people whose names she was discouraged from learning. Edward Sr. was not cruel by the standards of his peers. He didn't beat his slaves with particular enthusiasm. He allowed them holidays at Christmas. He even permitted marriages among them, though he sold children without hesitation when finances demanded it. He considered himself a benevolent master, which was perhaps the worst kind because he believed his own lies. He quoted scripture over dinner, spoke of civilizing the African race, saw himself as father to people who would have killed him given half a chance. Annabel learned to exist in this world. She hosted dinners where women discussed recipes while their husbands discussed which slaves brought the highest prices. She attended church services where ministers preached that slavery was God's design, that the Negro was meant to serve, that rebellion was sin. She embroidered in parlors while outside her window human beings worked themselves to death in fields they would never own. And she told herself she had no choice, that this was simply how things were, that one woman could not change a system built over centuries. Then Samuel arrived. Edward Sr. purchased him in 1824 from a failing plantation in South Carolina. Samuel was 17, tall, with hands that seemed made for creating things. His mother had been freed by her master's will, then recaptured by the master's son who claimed the will was forged. She had taught Samuel to read using a hidden Bible before she was sold away. He never saw her again. Edward Sr. saw Samuel's intelligence and put him to work as a carpenter. Samuel built furniture, repaired the mansion, constructed additions as the estate grew. He worked with a precision that caught Annabel's attention. She would watch him sometimes from the parlor window, see the care he took with each piece, the way he ran his hands over wood like he was reading it. There was dignity in his movements that no amount of bondage could erase. For years, that was all it was. The mistress noticing the skill of a slave, nothing more. But after Edward Sr. died in 1838, something shifted. Edward Jr. was 24, arrogant, eager to prove himself. He moved into the master bedroom, started making decisions about the estate, treated his mother like a guest in her own home. And Annabel, who had spent 21 years being the perfect wife, found she had no role left to play. She started walking the grounds more. Started paying attention to things she had ignored for decades. The slave quarters where families lived in structures worse than her horse stables. The kitchen where women worked from dawn to midnight. The workshops where men created beauty they could never possess. And Samuel, now 32, still building, still carrying himself with quiet strength despite everything this world had tried to take from him. Their first real conversation happened in the garden on a morning in late autumn. She was cutting roses, moving without thought, and he was repairing the gazebo. He said something about the wood, how it would last another generation if properly maintained. She responded without thinking, asked a question about the joints. And they talked, just talked, for 20 minutes about carpentry and roses and nothing that mattered except that they were two people speaking to each other as equals. It happened again a week later. Then 3 days after that, conversations stretched longer. She learned he loved stories, that his mother had told him tales from Africa mixed with Bible stories, creating something new. He learned she played piano. That music was the only thing that had ever made her feel anything real. They found reasons to be in the same spaces: the garden, the workshop, the library where he sometimes repaired shelves. Edward Jr. noticed before she did. Saw his mother smiling at a slave. Saw her using Samuel's name instead of just calling boy. He said nothing at first, just watched with those cold eyes he inherited from his father. Watched and judged and waited. The first time Samuel touched her hand, it was an accident. He was showing her a piece he was carving, a magnolia flower emerging from walnut wood, and their fingers brushed. The touch lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but Annabelle felt it for days. Felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. Want. Not the performative desire of her marriage, but genuine longing. She told herself to stop. Told herself she was being foolish, dangerous. But the heart doesn't listen to reason, especially a heart that has been silent for so long. She found herself seeking him out, bringing him water when he worked, asking questions just to hear his voice. And Samuel, who could have been beaten for even looking at her wrong, who was risking everything just by speaking to her, Samuel didn't look away. The kiss happened in December, in the workshop after dark. She had gone looking for him with some excuse about a broken chair. He was alone, working by lamplight. She said something, he responded, and then there was silence, the kind of silence that asks a question. He moved first, just a half step. She closed the distance. The kiss was gentle, questioning, terrified. When they pulled apart, they were both shaking. From that moment, there was no going back. They began meeting in secret, in the hours between midnight and dawn when the house slept. In the forgotten chapel room that hadn't been used since Edward Sr.'s mother died, in corners of the estate where no one looked. They talked about impossible things: freedom, a life together, a world where love didn't have a color. Samuel never asked her to marry him. She asked him. On a February night cold enough to see their breath, she said the words, "Marry me, not legally, but truly. Be my husband in the eyes of God, even if not in the eyes of man." He stared at her like she had lost her mind. Maybe she had, but he said yes. They planned it carefully. 3 house servants they trusted, people who loved Samuel, who had seen Annabelle's kindness in small moments. A ceremony in the chapel room, vows spoken in whispers, rings made from melted silverware that wouldn't be missed. It happened on a Sunday in March while Edward Jr. was in Charleston on business. 15 minutes that changed everything. That night, as Annabelle placed the iron chain around Samuel's wrist during their secret vows, transforming the symbol of his bondage into a wedding gift, she saw everything clearly. The woman who once feared scandal had vanished, replaced by whatever her love demanded her to become. The first morning after their secret vows, Annabelle wore Samuel's crude ring beneath her widow's gloves. No one noticed. No one suspected. For 3 stolen months she was his. She had imagined it would feel like living a lie, but it felt like the opposite. Like she was finally telling the truth after decades of performance. Every morning she woke in her proper bedroom, dressed in her proper clothes, played the proper widow. And every night she slipped through shadows to Samuel's quarters, shed propriety like a costume, and became simply a woman with her husband. They created a small life in the spaces between danger. Samuel carved her a wooden comb. She brought him books from the library, read to him by candlelight. They talked about everything and nothing. His dreams of seeing the ocean not from a slave ship but as a free man. her memories of northern winters, snow that covered everything in silence. They built a world that existed only in whispers and touches, and moments stolen from a society that wanted them dead. But cracks appeared almost immediately. A house servant named Beth, young and terrified of being sold, noticed Annabelle leaving the main house after midnight. Followed her once. Saw enough. Beth said nothing, but her silence had a price. She began to shake when Annabelle entered a room. Avoided looking at Samuel entirely. Fear is its own language, and Annabelle learned to read it. She tried to buy Beth's silence with kindness. Gave her easier tasks. Spoke gently. But kindness from a white woman couldn't compete with the terror of what Edward Jr. would do if he discovered Beth had known about the marriage and said nothing. Every day Beth didn't speak was just another day closer to when she would. Edward Jr.'s suspicion grew like mold, slow and poisonous. He started appearing in the house at odd hours, asking questions about his mother's activities. Where was she last night? Why was she in the workshop? Why did she address that slave by name? Annabelle answered carefully, kept her face neutral, lied with the ease of someone who had been performing for decades. But she saw calculation in her son's eyes. He was her father's son, and Edward Sr. had always known when the numbers didn't add up. Samuel wanted to run. "We could go north," he said one night, holding her close in the darkness. "People like us, we could disappear. Start over." Annabelle had already considered it, had even made quiet contact with an abolitionist sympathizer who passed through Savannah, a Quaker woman who helped runaways. But running meant leaving everything, living as fugitives, knowing they could be captured and dragged back at any moment. Still, it seemed like the only option. They planned it for June, 3 months to prepare. The Quaker woman would return, provide false papers, a route north through the swamps. Samuel would leave first, disappear during a Sunday service. Annabelle would follow 3 days later, claiming to visit family in Charleston. They would meet in a safe house outside Savannah and vanish into whatever life they could build. But Edward Jr. moved faster. On a Tuesday in May, he confronted his mother in the parlor. His voice was controlled, but his hands shook with rage. "I know what you've been doing," he said. "I know about the slave." Annabelle felt ice flood her veins. "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. Edward laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Don't insult me. You think I'm blind? You think the servants don't talk?" Beth had broken. Edward had threatened to sell her baby south, and she told him everything. The secret meetings, the wedding ceremony, all of it. Annabelle saw her life split into before and after this moment. Everything that came before was already gone. Everything after would be blood. "You've disgraced this family," Edward said, his voice shaking. "You've disgraced yourself. My father's widow, coupling with his property like a common whore." Annabelle stood, found strength she didn't know she possessed. "Samuel is not property. He is my husband." The slap came so fast she didn't see it. Her cheek burned. Edward grabbed her arm, dragged her to the window. "Watch," he said. "Watch what happens to slaves who forget their place." Samuel was already in the courtyard, held by 2 overseers. Edward Jr. had planned this carefully. He had an audience, other slaves forced to watch, a lesson being delivered. Annabelle tried to break free, but Edward's grip was iron. "You'll watch every second," he hissed. "You'll see what your love cost him. 27 lashes. The whip was thick leather designed to tear flesh. Samuel didn't scream at first, bit down on his own tongue hard enough to bleed. But by the 10th lash, his back was ribbons. By the 20th, he was choking on his own blood. By the 27th, he was making sounds that weren't quite human anymore. The last word he spoke, barely a whisper, was her name. When they cut him down, he was still breathing, but barely. The overseer looked to Edward Jr. for instruction. Edward's answer was simple. "Leave him." They dragged the body, because that's what it was now, to the edge of the quarters and left it in the dirt. Samuel died sometime before dawn, alone, in pain, calling for a wife who couldn't reach him. Edward finally released Annabel after Samuel stopped moving. She ran to the courtyard, fell beside the body that had held her just 12 hours before. His back was destroyed, blood soaking into the earth. His eyes were open but seeing nothing. She pressed her forehead to his, whispered the vows they had spoken 3 months ago. Till death do us part. Death had come. But the parting, that would take longer. They dragged her away while she was still screaming. Carried her into the house and up 3 flights of stairs to the attic, a space used for storage and punishment. Edward locked the door himself. "You'll stay here until you remember who you are," he said through the wood. "Until you repent for what you've done. Until you beg God's forgiveness." Annabel didn't respond. She was beyond words. She crawled to the small window that overlooked the courtyard and watched as they rolled Samuel's body onto a cart. No funeral, no marker, just another dead slave, buried somewhere in the fields with no name to mark the spot. 3 months of love erased in an afternoon of violence. The first days in the attic were a blur of grief. She didn't eat, barely breathed, just stared at the walls and replayed every moment. The wedding, his laugh, the way he said her name, the sound of the whip, his blood on the ground, over and over until memory and nightmare became the same thing. But on the 4th day, something shifted. A house servant brought food, a girl named Clara who had witnessed the wedding. She set the tray down, her hands shaking. Before she left, she pressed something into Annabel's hand. Samuel's wedding ring, the crude thing made from melted silver. Clara whispered, "He would want you to have it." Then she was gone. Annabel closed her fist around the ring, felt the rough metal press into her palm, and something inside her, something broken and screaming, went quiet, cold, clear. Grief transformed into something with edges, with purpose. She stopped crying, started eating, started observing. From the attic window she could see into the courtyard, could track the rhythms of the house. Edward Jr.'s patterns. He rose at dawn, took breakfast in the dining room, rode out to inspect the fields mid-morning, returned for dinner at 6, retired to his bedroom by 10. Every day, predictable, arrogant, certain of his safety in his own home. She studied the attic door. The lock was old, the wood warped. She found a loose floorboard, worked it free over days, fashioned it into a tool, tested the lock at night when the house slept. It took 2 weeks, but she learned how to open it. Could slip out and back in without anyone knowing. She didn't leave yet. Just practiced, prepared, waited. Clara brought meals every day. Annabel asked careful questions. Where was Beth now? Sold already, Clara whispered. Sent south with her baby, Edward's mercy. Where was Samuel's body buried? Clara didn't know. Did they burn his things? No, Clara said. They're still in his quarters. No one wants to touch them. One night, Annabel slipped from the attic using her makeshift key. The house was dark, everyone asleep. She made her way to Samuel's quarters, a journey of 50 yards that felt like miles. Inside, everything was as he'd left it. Tools arranged carefully, the half-finished magnolia carving, and in the corner, coiled on a shelf, the iron chain that had been his restraint when he first arrived at the estate. The symbol of his bondage, the thing he had jokingly called his wedding gift to her during their ceremony, laughing darkly at the irony. Annabel picked up the chain. It was heavy, cold, the metal worn smooth by years against skin. She wrapped it around her hands, tested its weight. It was strong, strong enough to hold a man, strong enough to kill one. She took the chain back to the attic, hid it under the floorboards. Over the following weeks, she cleaned it, studied it, made it ready. She memorized Edward's schedule with the precision of someone planning worship. Every detail mattered. The creak of the 3rd stair, the way his bedroom door stuck, the fact that he slept deeply, confident that he was safe. The shattered pieces of Annabel Crow weren't just grieving. They were sharpening into something her son would never see coming. The storm came on the 1st of June, exactly 3 months after the wedding that wasn't supposed to be. Rain hammered the roof of the Crow mansion like bullets, thunder rolling across the Georgia sky like God clearing his throat. Annabelle sat in the attic darkness, holding Samuel's chain in her lap, running her fingers over the metal that had marked him as property, that had scarred his wrists, that had been the price of his existence in this world. She thought about the last time she had touched him alive. His hands in her hair, his voice saying her name like it was sacred, the way he had looked at her when she asked him to marry her, like she had offered him not just love but proof that humanity could exist in this nightmare. She thought about his last word in the courtyard, Annabelle, not a plea, not a curse, just her name, saying it one final time before the world took his voice forever. She had spent 2 months in this attic. 2 months of grief that had calcified into something harder, something that didn't weep, something that waited. Tonight the waiting was over. Edward Jr. had announced at dinner, loud enough for the servants to hear, loud enough for the news to travel up 3 flights of stairs, that he was committing his mother to an asylum in Charleston. The arrangements were made. The wagon would come at dawn. She would be taken away, declared mad, locked in a room with barred windows where she could cause no more scandal, where she could disappear quietly while the Crow name was rehabilitated. He thought he had won. Thought his mother was broken. Thought the problem was solved. Men like Edward Jr. always thought that. Thought power was permanent. Thought violence was the final word. They never understood that silence wasn't surrender. It was planning. Annabelle bathed for the first time in weeks. The house was settling into sleep, the storm masking any sounds she made. She washed Samuel's blood from her memory, though she would never be clean of it. Dressed in black, not as mourning, but as purpose. Took the chain from its hiding place, wrapped it around her shoulders like a shawl. The metal was cold against her neck, but it warmed quickly. Memory has temperature. Clara had brought dinner earlier, and as planned, she left the attic door unlocked. Just an oversight, just a mistake. Clara's hands had shaken as she set down the tray, but her eyes were steady. There were some betrayals that were actually blessings, some crimes that were actually justice. Annabelle waited until midnight, until the storm was at its peak and the house was as dark as it would get. She opened the door slowly, testing each inch for sound. The hinges had been oiled. Clara's work, or perhaps someone else's. Perhaps there were more people in this house who wanted to see what would happen when the widow finally stopped being quiet. She moved through the mansion like smoke. This was her home. She had walked these halls for 22 years, knew every creak, every shadow, every way to become invisible. The storm helped. Thunder covered her footsteps. Lightning illuminated her path in brief flashes, then left her in darkness again. Perfect. Edward Jr.'s bedroom was on the 2nd floor, the master suite that had belonged to his father. He had moved into it the day after the old man died, claimed it like inheritance, like it was his right to occupy his father's space, his father's authority, his father's cruelty. The door was slightly ajar. He never locked it. Why would he? He was the master here. He was safe. Annabelle stood outside that door for a long moment. This was the last chance to turn back, the last moment of before. After this, she would be something different. Not widow, not mother, something else. Something the world would call monster. She thought about Samuel one more time. His gentle hands, his quiet strength, the way he had made her feel human in a world designed to turn people into property. And she pushed the door open. The room was dark except for occasional lightning flashes. Edward Jr. lay in his father's bed, on his back, snoring softly, one arm thrown over his face. He looked young in sleep, almost innocent. But Annabelle remembered watching from a window as he ordered Samuel's murder. Remembered the satisfaction in his voice, remembered that this was the man who had killed love because it offended his pride. She unwrapped the chain from her shoulders. Let one end drop. The metal clinked softly, but the storm swallowed the sound. She moved to the side of the bed, stood looking down at her only child, the baby she had birthed in pain, the boy she had raised, the man who had become his father's son in every way that mattered. Edward's eyes opened. For a moment he didn't understand what he was seeing. His mother, standing over him, holding something metal. Then recognition, then fear. "Mother?" he said, his voice thick with sleep. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer, just stared at him with eyes that had stopped crying 2 months ago. Edward tried to sit up, but Annabelle moved faster. She wrapped the chain around his throat before he could raise his hands. "Hold tight," Edward gasped, tried to grab her wrists, but she was stronger than he expected. Grief had made her iron. "Mother, stop!" he choked out, his fingers clawing at the chain. "Stop this, please." She leaned close, her voice quiet as prayer. "You made me watch," she said. "Every lash, every moment, you made me watch him die. Now you watch me." She pulled tighter. Edward bucked beneath her, trying to throw her off. But she had position and surprise and something he could never match. She had purpose. The chain cut into his throat. His face turned red, then purple. His legs kicked, knocking over the bedside table. The lamp crashed to the floor, oil spreading across the carpet. Lightning flashed, and for a moment the room was bright as day. Annabelle saw her reflection in the mirror across the room. A woman with wild hair and empty eyes and a chain wrapped around her hands like rosary beads. She looked like vengeance wearing her face. Edward's movements were weakening now. His hands fell from the chain. His eyes, his father's eyes, stared up at her with incomprehension. He had never imagined this. Never thought his proper northern mother capable of anything but tears and obedience. He had forgotten that northern women could be cold as winter. That quiet didn't mean weak, that a woman could love deeply enough to kill for it. This was his wedding gift, Annabelle whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. "This chain." He joked about it. Said at least if you owned him, he'd belong to love. Said he'd rather wear your chain than be free without you. She pulled tighter, her whole body shaking now. Not from effort, from grief finally finding its voice. "You killed my husband, Edward. You killed the only person who ever made me feel real." Edward tried to speak. Couldn't. His lips moved soundlessly. His body gave one final convulsion. Then stillness. The storm outside seemed to pause with him. The thunder distant now, the rain softening, as if even the weather was taking a breath after violence. Annabelle held the chain tight for another minute, making sure. Then 2 minutes. Then 3. Finally, she released it. Edward's head lolled to the side, eyes open, staring at nothing. There was a mark around his throat, deep and purple, the exact width of the chain that had marked Samuel's wrists for 15 years. Symmetry had a certain beauty. She sat back on the edge of the bed, the chain coiled in her lap. The room smelled of rain and oil and something copper. She felt empty. Not satisfied. Not triumphant, just empty, like she had poured everything out and now there was only the container left, hollow and light. She looked at her son's body and felt nothing. Not regret, not love, nothing. She should run, she thought distantly. Should flee while the house still slept. But where would she go? There was nowhere in this world for a woman who had done what she just did. No north far enough, no hiding place deep enough. She had known that when she made her choice. This wasn't about escape. It was about balance, about making sure that Samuel's death didn't go unanswered, about proving that even in a world built on chains, even in a system designed to crush love, even then, someone could stand up and say no. Annabelle stood slowly. Her legs were steady. She walked to the window, looked out at the estate spread below her. The fields that had drunk so much blood. The slave quarters where people slept lightly, always ready to run. The big house that had been her prison disguised as comfort. All of it built on suffering, all of it demanding silence. She had been silent for 42 years. She was done now. The storm had passed, leaving only soft rain and distant thunder. Morning would come soon. The servants would wake. Someone would find Edward Jr.'s body with a slave's chain around his throat. And they would come for her. But she had already done the impossible. She had loved across a line that was supposed to be uncrossable. She had married a man her world said wasn't a man. And when they killed him for it, she had answered in the only language this society understood. Annabel placed the chain carefully on Edward's chest. Let it coil there like a snake, like a wedding ring, like the truth. Then she walked calmly back to her attic, closed the door, sat by the window, and waited for dawn with the kind of peace that only comes after everything is lost and everything is settled. Samuel, she thought. I kept my vow. Till death do us part. Death had come for him. Now it would come for her. But between those two moments there had been justice. Rough and brutal and final. Justice. The first scream came just after sunrise. A house servant finding the body, then running feet. Then more screams. The whole house erupting in chaos and horror. Annabel sat still in her attic, hands folded, and listened to her world end. It sounded like thunder. It sounded like freedom. It sounded like love, finally speaking in a voice loud enough to be heard. The morning light found Annabel Crow sitting in the attic window, watching the chaos below. Samuel's wedding chain still lay coiled on her son's chest, a message written in iron and blood. Justice, she learned, wore many faces. Sometimes it wore a mother's. They found her within the hour. The sheriff came with 6 men, all armed, all nervous. They climbed the attic stairs slowly, expecting resistance, violence, madness. What they found was a 42-year-old woman in a black dress, sitting calmly with her hands folded, waiting. She looked at them with eyes that had stopped asking for anything. Not mercy, not understanding. Nothing. Mrs. Crow, the sheriff said carefully, as if speaking to a wild animal. We need you to come with us. Annabel stood without argument, smoothed her dress, walked past them down the stairs with her head high. As they led her through the house, servants pressed themselves against walls, staring. Some with horror, some with something else, something that looked almost like reverence. When they passed through the foyer, Clara was there, the young servant who had unlocked the attic door. Their eyes met for just a moment. Clara's hand moved to her heart, a gesture so small no one else saw it. Annabel nodded once. Some betrayals were blessings. Some crimes were love disguised. They took her to the Savannah jail, a brick building that smelled of sweat and fear and justice long delayed. The cell was small, one window high up that let in a square of sky. Annabel sat on the wooden bench and looked at that square of blue. Somewhere beyond it was a world that had never let her be free. Now she was freer than she had ever been. Strange how that worked. The trial was swift. 3 days from arrest to verdict. The courtroom packed with Savannah's finest, come to see the scandal in the flesh. The widow who married her slave. The mother who murdered her son. The woman who had violated every law of God and man. They stared at her like she was a creature from a nightmare. Perhaps she was. The prosecutor built his case with righteous fury. Painted Annabel as a woman corrupted, driven mad by unnatural desires, a cautionary tale about what happens when the natural order is broken. He spoke of Edward Jr.'s sterling character, his bright future stolen by his mother's insanity. He never mentioned Samuel. Slaves didn't exist in his version of the story. They were scenery, not characters. Annabel's defense lawyer, appointed by the court, barely tried. What was there to say? She had done it. Everyone knew she had done it. The chain still bore her fingerprints. The only question was whether she was mad or evil. The lawyer argued mad. It was the only argument that might save her from hanging. A woman driven insane by grief and loneliness, not responsible for her actions, needing treatment, not punishment. Annabelle sat through it all in silence. When the judge asked if she had anything to say in her defense, she stood. The courtroom went quiet. She looked out at the sea of white faces, at the gentry who had sipped wine at her table, at the women who had gossiped in her parlor, at the men who owned human beings and called it prosperity. And she spoke. "I married Samuel because I loved him," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Not to corrupt anything, not to offend anyone, because I loved him. He was a better man than any in this room." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Her lawyer tried to stop her, but she continued. "My son murdered my husband. That's what happened. You can call it whatever you want. Property destruction, discipline, but it was murder. And I answered it the only way this world understands." The judge's gavel came down like thunder. "That's enough, Mrs. Crow." But she wasn't finished. "I regret nothing," she said. "If I could go back, I would marry him again. I would kill for him again. Because love, real love, is worth more than all your laws and all your cruelty and all your righteous hypocrisy combined." They dragged her from the courtroom, still talking, still defiant. The jury deliberated for 43 minutes. Guilty. Sentence, death by hanging. The judge's face was grave as he pronounced it, said she had committed the worst crime a woman could commit, had violated the sanctity of family and race and order, said she would hang as a warning to others who might be tempted down similar paths. Annabelle accepted the sentence with the same calm she had shown throughout. She was led back to her cell, and she waited. In the days before the execution, something strange happened. Her story began to spread, not the version told in the courthouse, but the real version, whispered in slave quarters, passed from plantation to plantation. The widow who married her husband's slave, who loved him enough to kill for him, who chose love over law and paid the price without regret. In hushed voices, people spoke her name with reverence. White women, trapped in loveless marriages, secretly wondered if they would have her courage. Enslaved people saw in her story a crack in the system, proof that even white folks could choose love over property, humanity over hierarchy. Some called her saint, some called her sinner, but everyone remembered. The day of her execution came in mid-June, 3 months after Samuel's death. They dressed her in white, said it was tradition. But white didn't feel like purity. It felt like defiance, like a wedding dress, like victory. The gallows had been built in the town square. The crowd was enormous, come to see justice done or vengeance delivered, or a woman destroyed for daring to love wrong. Annabelle walked to the gallows with her head high, climbed the stairs without help. When they asked if she had final words, she looked out at the crowd, found Clara in the back and other servants from the Crow estate watching with tears streaming, found faces in the crowd that looked like they understood, and she spoke. "I only did what you all taught me," she said clearly. "You taught me that love doesn't matter, that people are property, that some lives are worth more than others. I learned those lessons well, and I used them." She paused, looked directly at the plantation owners in the front row. "You taught me violence too. How to watch it, how to accept it, how to let it happen and call it order. I learned that lesson best of all." The executioner moved to place the hood, but she stopped him with a look. "I loved Samuel," she said, voice breaking for the first time. "And he loved me. And for 3 months we were more human than any of you in your fine houses with your fine manners built on blood. Remember that." They hanged her with the sun high overhead. Annabelle Crow's last thought before the trapdoor opened was of Samuel's hands, building something beautiful in the workshop, creating art in a world that told him he was nothing. Then there was darkness and peace, and an ending that somehow felt like freedom. But her story didn't end there. It couldn't. Stories like hers don't die with the body. They travel. They transform. Within days, the whispers had become songs. Within weeks, the songs had traveled to plantations across Georgia, the Carolinas, deeper south. The widow's chain, they called it. The story of forbidden love and terrible vengeance. The story of a woman who chose her heart over her world and paid with everything. Abolitionist papers in the North picked up the tale, made her a symbol of how slavery corrupted everyone, how the system destroyed love, how even white women were prisoners in need of liberation. Southern papers condemned her as proof of Northern moral decay, warned of the dangers of educating women and softening rules. But even in their condemnation, they spread the story further. In slave quarters, mothers told the story to daughters. See what love can do. See how even chains can be turned into weapons. See how the impossible is only impossible until someone does it. Annabelle Crowe became legend. Part warning, part inspiration, part prayer. The widow who loved wrong and killed right and died without apology. The Crowe estate was sold within 6 months. Too much scandal. Too much blood. The servants were scattered to other plantations, or fled north with help from the same abolitionist network Annabelle had contacted. Clara made it to Pennsylvania, carried Annabelle's story with her, told it in churches and meeting halls and anywhere people needed to hear that love was stronger than law. Years later, when the war finally came and the chains finally broke, old men and women would still tell the story. Remember Annabelle Crowe? Remember the widow's chain? Remember what she did for love? And young people would listen, would ask if it was true, would be told that truth didn't matter as much as what the story taught. That even in the darkest systems, even in the cruelest worlds, love could still speak. And when it did, it could shake foundations. Annabelle Crowe's name would be whispered for generations. Not as a madwoman, but as living proof that even a Southern matriarch could choose love over law and turn the very chains of bondage into instruments of judgment. Samuel's wedding gift had come full circle, and in 1839 Savannah, that was the most dangerous revolution of all. If this story of forbidden love and ultimate defiance moved you, share it with those who need to hear that even the most silenced voices can scream through action. Subscribe for more untold stories of those who chose love over law and paid the price with everything except their souls. Drop a comment. Do you believe Annabelle's revenge was justice or something darker? Let's discuss.